This is the podcast of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. Welcome.
Welcome to a new episode of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. My name is Matilde Carreira, and I will be the research assistant conducting this podcast episode in conversation with Grace Camara and Pallavi Sharma from Beyond Human Rights Compliance. Beyond Human Rights Compliance is an international legal practice specialized in the implementation of human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct. Beyond Human Rights Compliance are headquartered in London with a global footprint. They advise businesses, trade associations, and investors on human rights due diligence, from policy to strategy through to on-the-ground implementation. Beyond Human Rights Compliance's team comprises a diverse group of experts, including international humanitarian lawyers, experienced business leaders, and development actors. With a wealth of industry experience and decades of working in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, they are well-equipped to tackle complex human rights challenges. BHRC take a client-centric approach and understand that each client has unique needs and challenges. Their team of experts tailor solutions that exceed expectations, ensuring responsible business practices that make a positive impact on your business and communities. Grace Camara and Pallavi Sharma are senior legal advisors at Beyond Human Rights Compliance. Grace leads the garment and apparel portfolio, and Pallavi leads agriculture and commodities portfolio. Both Grace and Pallavi work with some of the world's biggest garment and agriculture companies, providing bespoke solutions on human rights due diligence in areas such as living wages and garment upstream supplies, such as cotton. Thank you for accepting our invites. A key area of concern for international companies operating in the garment and agriculture sectors is the prevalent use of piece rate payment systems, which have been strongly linked to labor violations. This session, led by Grace Camara and Pallavi Sharma, senior legal advisors at Beyond Human Rights Compliance, will provide a deep dive into the concept of piece rate payments and the legal framework regarding such payments. Grace and Pallavi will provide some practical steps that international companies can take to protect workers from this type of wage violations. Now we will be starting the questions. So, what are piece rate payments and why are they controversial?
Many thanks for the introduction, Matilde. This is Grace here. Really delighted to be here and as you said, take a deep dive into the concept of piece rate payments. So piece rate payments are a compensation method whereby workers are remunerated based on the number of units they produce or tasks they complete, rather than receiving a fixed hourly wage. So according to the ILO definition, piece rate occurs when workers are paid by the units performed, for example, the number of t-shirts they produce, instead of being paid on the basis of time spent on the job. Piece rate systems are commonly employed in specific industries, such as the garment and agri industries, or occupations characterized by repetitive tasks, where employees can exert significant control over their output. So, for example, in the garment sector, I can give you a couple of examples of what piece rate payments look like. Workers in garment factories that are paid based on the number of garments they sew is probably the most common example of piece rate payments. So you are paid per shirt, per dress, for example. And then you also have, which is, again, is quite specific to the garment sector, the production of very intricate embroidery or embellishment work. And so oftentimes workers who are engaged in these kinds of activities may receive payments based on the number of stitches they complete or the complexity of a design. And then also within that same sector, you have textile mill workers who are involved in fabric cutting, stitching, or assembling textile components, and they may be compensated based on the volume of fabric that they process or the number of textile products that they're able to assemble. So those are just some examples within the garment sector, and perhaps I can hand over to my colleague Pallavi to give us some examples in the agricultural sector.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Matilde. This is Pallavi. So just to add to what Grace was saying, piece rate systems are very common in agriculture sector. And in generally, in the agriculture sector, workers are paid by weight, example in tea plucking, or by area they work on. For example, if they are asked to apply fertilizer in X square meters of area. So this is depending on the output of the worker produced at the end of the day, and then they are paid commensurate to it. Another reason why employers choose piece rate is because sometimes they don't have in-person oversight on how the worker is performing the task. For example, in home-based pieces of work, like Grace mentioned, in the agriculture sector, this could be like rolling tobacco cigarettes, where workers are essentially working out of their home, and employers do not have an oversight on how they are performing the work. So what they do is that instead of time rate, they essentially make the payment contingent on the number of pieces that the worker produces at the end of the day. So generally in the agriculture sector, a target is set for each day. And this target could vary on depending on various factors, such as productivity, the geography and difficulty of the terrain from where workers are plucking fruit or where workers are harvesting grain. It can also be affected by seasonality. For example, how much produce is there to be picked by workers? Piece rate wages in the agriculture sector can also vary according to the quality of the produce that is plucked. For example, in the tea plantation sectors, this is very common. The amount of money that a worker would get at the end of the day would not just depend on the quality of tea leaves plucked, on the quantity of tea leaves plucked, but also on the quality of the tea leaves that the workers has plucked at the end of the day. So this is how, in general, the system works in the agriculture sector. And if I can just take this opportunity to segue into the next question about why this is controversial. So as I said, that this is a mainstay of the agri sector. Pretty much all plantation commodities use the system of payment to their workers. The main controversy lies not in what piece rate payment systems are, but how they are structured. So generally what we see in agriculture sector is that the targets are set very high, and it is not realistically possible for a worker of average capacity to achieve that target in a work day of 8 hours. This has many ramifications. For example, workers tend to bring in their unpaid family members, including children, to accomplish the set target for the day so that they can make minimum wage. This is really problematic. This kind of work has actually been found as one of the key drivers of child labor in the agriculture sector. So this can have different consequences. Setting this target right is one of the biggest challenges in the sector. And perhaps Grace can come in on the garment sector at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pallavi. I mean, we're seeing in the garment sector similar issues as well. There's exploitation of workers who are pressured to meet unrealistic production targets. In the garment sector specifically, you'll see short lead times, which are based around certain big orders coming in, and factories want to meet those orders. And so they pressure their workers. And this can lead to, unrealistic production targets for them just to earn a living wage. It can result in excessive working hours, substandard working conditions, and overall inadequate compensation. There's also very much documented evidence of inequality and discrimination when it comes to piece rate systems, because certain groups, usually garment workers, tend to be majority women and often migrant workers as well, and they can face additional barriers to meeting those production targets. So you have a situation where it's almost impossible for them because they may have other they may not be able to work as long hours. They may have other commitments, children, for example, with women sort of maybe being the primary carers for children. So they're really restricted on what they can do, and therefore they're not able to meet those production targets that may be exasperated because of short lead times or big orders coming in. And then in addition to that, with piece rate workers, they tend to be sort of more perhaps not as they tend to be workers who are a little bit more casual, and so they may also lack access to social protection measures such as healthcare, pensions, and unemployment benefits, leaving them very vulnerable to economic instability and poverty traps. They're not always casual workers. It really depends on the system and the setup, but oftentimes, that they're not able to access those benefits as well. So really the system, as Pallavi said, it's not this idea of paying per garment or paying per product per se, but it's the way that it's implemented that really poses the biggest risk. And the ILO is very aware of this and has stated that there are risks around having these kinds of structures. While it doesn't expressly prohibit piece rate payments, it has, the organization has definitely identified the risks of having such payments in place. And really, the key thing as well is to remember that members of the ILO are mandated to implement a minimum wage law within their countries, and if earning piece rate means that you fall below earning that minimum wage, then there's also a legal issue there as well.
So, just speaking of the ILO, I used to work at the ILO before joining PHRC, and one of the issues that we saw playing out in the plantation sector was that generally workers were completely absent from any discussion on how these piece rate targets were set. And this was deeply problematic because they were unilaterally set by plantation companies. And at times, there's an interesting example that I recall. At times, these targets overlook other factors such as adequate tools or PPE kits, which may have an effect on how efficiently and productively workers are performing their day. There was an interesting case study where we noted that women workers were doubly disadvantaged because the PPE kits that they were given were not designed for women, they were designed for men. So women, after wearing those PPE kits, were finding it even harder to efficiently perform their work, resulting in less productivity, less units of work recorded, less wages paid out at the end of the day. So these are the issues that you can only understand if you are in very close contact with workers who are actually performing this work and the organizations that are representing them.
Thank you very much for your answer. The second question was actually going to be how price rate payments differ in the garment and agriculture sectors, but I think you've covered it perfectly already. Would you like to add something, or do you want to move on to the next question?
One thing that I would like to add, perhaps Grace can correct me.
I think perhaps we can move on to the next question.
Just a quick comment on how in agriculture there's a lot of piece rates are contingent a lot on the harvest and the quality of harvest. So if you have a good harvest, then you are more likely to collect good quality fruit in the same span of time as opposed to having a bad harvest. So perhaps that's how this sector differs from textiles, where they're just market demands determining what is the piece rate, how many pieces are to be delivered at the end of the day. Similarly, in agriculture, worker productivity is very heavily influenced by weather and environmental factors. For example, on an exceptionally hot day, a worker is less likely to perform as efficiently as opposed to a normal day.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. With the new European Union due diligence rules, how do you think they will impact the use of piece rate payments?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. With the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive coming into force in the next couple of years, I do think it's going to impact the extent to which companies view the risk of having those sorts of payment systems within their supply chain. So I think they're going to be more risk averse, knowing the risks that we've pointed out earlier of exploitation of workers. Of course, the CSDDD for short doesn't directly refer to piece rate payments. It talks more generally about human rights due diligence, risk-based due diligence with regard to human rights and also, of course, environmental rights. But definitely within that sort of more broad spectrum, piece rate payments as a risky practice, which could lead to exploitation of workers, definitely falls within that scope. And so I do think companies are going to think twice about how to approach this issue going forward. If I can give an example of some legislation which I think may inform how companies will approach the CSDDD going forward, then I think that will kind of help us understand sort of the context and how this has been approached from a legislative point of view, because obviously with the CSDDD, there's still a transposition process that needs to be undertaken so that it's made international law in member states. And so there's still a consultation process that will have to happen. And of course, existing legislation will inform that consultation process. So if we look, for example, at the ban on piece rate payments in California, I think this provides a good basis for how companies should really view some of the risks around these sorts of payment systems and how indeed going forward, how policy may develop. So the Garment and Worker Protection Act is a landmark California law that came into effect in January 2022. And the purpose of the law is to address the root causes of systematic wage theft in the apparel manufacturing sector in California. Specifically by eliminating the piece rate system of pay and introducing new liability on fashion brands to incentivize them to stamp out workplace violations. So the Act specifically aims to end wage theft and enforce better working conditions. Prior to the change in the law, the average garment worker in the Californian manufacturing sector would earn, say, for example, in Los Angeles, would earn roughly around $5.85 an hour, and sometimes as little as $2.68 an hour. So these are figures that have been quoted by Remake, which was one of the key organizations in helping to secure this law. So by closing the loophole in the law, the new act has had an effect of nearly tripling garment workers' hourly wages and also, of course, giving them a path to justice where there has been wage theft or some sort of labor violation with regard to wages. The Act also underpins a concept of joint liability, which I think is very important to mention because it means that brands and retailers share the responsibility alongside their manufacturers to stop workplace violations and ensure legal wages. So it's not just left to the suppliers to fix the issue. It's actually required that brands and retailers also look at the issue as well. And this follows a finding by the US Department of Labor that the heart of wage theft lies squarely with the wage theft, the problem of wage theft rather, lies squarely with the pricing structure dictated by retailers. So clearly retailers have a huge role to play to remedy this issue. And that idea of influence and leverage is also echoed in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. If you read the provisions around living wages, and there aren't very many, but the only real obligation is on international business, on companies to use their influence to address the issue of living wages. There's still no mandate to pay living wages, but it is assumed that they have a level of influence in the industry, in the sector, and they are required to use that influence to try and remedy the situation and improve the situation around living wages. So there is reference, again, while not directly to piece rate, but we know that piece rate systems can contribute towards definitely towards the wage gap, if not even towards minimum wages not being paid. So the two pieces of legislation, I think, work very well together. And this idea of joint liability is really a game changer in the sector and has really changed the business model in fashion, because it really ensures that retailers have to act as allies and really tackle these issues. It also levels the playing field for brands and manufacturers who are already paying fairly and are operating responsibly, and so it means that everyone is sort of, you know, on the same page and putting in the same amount of effort. So the joint liability approach, I think, is really the key game changer there. As far as the CSDDD, of course, it's more watered down in respect of wages, but you know, anything that leads to labor violations is clearly stated within the CSDDD as being the responsibility of international brands. If it's in their supply, or international companies, if it's in their supply chain, they would be expected to take action.
This is well put, Grace. And just to add to what Grace has already quite succinctly elaborated on, I would also trace back, I would also bring into conversation the Forced Labor Directive, which is soon to come into force. Even though it doesn't directly talk about wages, but wages are one of the key drivers of poverty, death cycles, and forced labor. And there is a lot of research and empirical data out there on this. So I think when it comes into force, we would have to rethink our conversations about how wage systems are designed to ensure that workers are not trapped in cycles of poverty and debt at the upstream segments of most global value chains. So this is another thing that I would like to sort of think about. And as Grace rightly said, that the CSDDD is kind of now pushing us to rethink how piece rate systems are designed. Living wage, after incorporating living wage in one of the rights that have to be respected by companies in their operations along their value chains, we have to start considering piece rate systems which can adequately ensure that a worker earns a living wage in a standard 8-hour workday, while building in breaks for meals, for going to the toilet, for taking a little bit of rest, and so on and so forth. So we really have to rethink our systems of piece rate and attach it to a living wage now, not just a minimum wage. I would also like to talk about few domestic legislations. Grace already gave an example of the ban on piece rate in California. There are some jurisdictions which have not banned piece rates per se, but they are trying to come up with ways in which these systems can be improved so as to serve the needs of the employees and the employers. For example, in Kerala, in India, there are minimum wage legislations around wages of tea pluckers in plantations, where it's not just piece rate, but a combination of a fixed time rate and then piece rate. Piece rates there are also categorized according to slabs. So for example, if you pick leaves between 0 to 10 kgs, then you get X amount of money. If you pick up more than 10 and between 10 to 20 kgs, then you get a premium. And this premium continuously increases to incentivize workers who are more productive or more skilled at plucking the right kind of leaves. And there is also a cap on how much a worker can be paid in terms of their output, so as to make sure that workers don't overstretch themselves in to get this premium. So there are some ways in which countries are experimenting with how they can make this system, which, as I said, is one of the integral elements of the agriculture sector right now. How can they make the system work for workers as well as employers?
So we have touched upon this, but maybe could you develop a bit more? What are the steps that suppliers and international companies can take to ensure fair wages to workers?
Yeah, I'm happy to expand on that a little bit. And I should also mention as well, we talked about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We should also mention that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is already in force, and that companies are required to disclose a level of wages that they pay to their workers, not only in their operations, but also eventually within their value chain as well. The value chain guidance is under consultation, so we'll know exactly what that looks like in due course. But there will be a requirement to disclose and report what you're paying, you know, what the workers in your supply chain are being paid, and whether indeed there are piece rate payments being included in that. So, and I think the point that Pallavi made around, you know, it's not just going to be a conversation around, piece rate, but it's going to be that comparison to living wages, and where piece rate are already potentially falling short of the minimum wage. then that just creates an even bigger gap. So this is something that companies definitely need to look at. So, what can they practically do? Well, there are a number of things that they can do, and in fact that we as Beyond Human Rights Compliance can help them with. The first thing would definitely be to adopt fairer wage practices, and fairer purchasing practices. So many international fashion brands, talking now about the garment sector, they've taken the step of prohibiting the use of piece rate payments by their suppliers. So they're prohibited under their supply chain agreements and maybe their supplier code of conduct, or at least that they are restricted such payments to very limited circumstances. For example, where they have a long-term relationship with that supplier, there's a lot of trust, they know they're not going to abuse the use of such payments, and they're comfortable that the risk is fairly low. Another step that a lot of fashion brands have taken and garment companies have taken is to outlaw home working. As Pallavi mentioned, this is a form of working which is particularly where piece rate payments are particularly prevalent. And the reason for that is you essentially involve subcontracting the production to workers to carry out these tasks in their home. There's usually a middleman or an agency. Again, it can seem a little bit of an opaque process, and the workers can be very, very vulnerable to exploitation. Oftentimes they're not being given the protections that are afforded to factory workers. And again, being predominantly women, they may face low wages, long hours, and unsafe working conditions because they don't have to comply necessarily with certain health and safety requirements. And so it's very important that companies really take an honest look and ask themselves whether they should completely outlaw home working, if not piece rate payments completely. And that's something that we know a lot of the brands that we've worked with and we've had discussions with, they do as a sort of blanket policy. So that, I think, it's one of the first steps that companies can take. A second, and we would strongly recommend this, and this is something that we can actively help companies put into place, is to adopt certain model contract clauses that promote shared liability. Again, we talked about this earlier in some of the legislation that we're seeing. There is this idea of joint liability. So this is where both the supplier and the international company, international brand, for example, will agree to look into this issue, will agree to address this issue and support, and the brand will support the supplier in remedying this issue. As well as joint liability, it's also important for brands to provide an incentive to suppliers to actually make changes. So, the supplier may come back and say, well, this is really the most realistic way of us, making any money or of employing these staff, and give a number of reasons why. And I'm sure Pallavi can expand on this in the agri sector, because I think this is more of an issue even in the agri sector in terms of what's practicable. So to have those dialogues, to have those conversations is really important, but also for brands to think about, the terms of the contracts they have with suppliers, the length of the contracts, the longer the contract, if that's, again, practical and there's that level of trust, will give, longer contracts will give suppliers more incentive to invest in their workforce, to invest in better systems. And so you can't necessarily expect by suppliers to make these changes without those assurances that they will have orders coming in, that they will have long-term work. So that's key as well. With commercial contracts, we always say, again, in addition to shared allocation of risk and responsibilities, there needs to be commitments from international companies, international brands to engage in purchasing practices that are fair, that incentivize suppliers, as I said, but also give access to remedy. So where there has been wage theft or underpayment, that there are clear avenues for workers to make complaints, and there are clear avenues for suppliers to address these complaints, with the international brands having some kind of oversight of the system, the grievance mechanism system. And that's something that we here at BHRC can definitely help with, because those can be very, very complex processes that require a lot of resources, a lot of oversight, and a lot of monitoring to make sure that there has been adequate redress for complainants. So it's really important for companies to make those commitments, and also be prepared where a supplier may say, no, we're not willing to not pay piece rate, or we're not willing to not have some home workers within our supply chain. It's important for companies to be ready to walk away. If they are going to end a business relationship, they should do so responsibly. They should have a policy in place which clearly outlines how they will make that decision. You don't want to, suppliers have a lot of leverage, they have a lot of influence, so you don't want a situation where you are severely impacting livelihoods unless it's absolutely necessary. So it's important to have that. If you do have a responsible exit strategy and policy, it's important to take into account on what basis you will exit, and the refusal to stop paying piece rate, for example, to do it under very restrictive and controlled conditions may in fact be one of those reasons. And in that case, you would then have to explore how you've assessed that is too much of too great a risk for your company, and why you've made that decision. And of course, if you do decide to end a business relationship, as much as possible, trying to remedy any underpayments or wage theft that has occurred as a result of those types of payments. And then just lastly to say as well that international brands should also ensure that they have robust social auditing systems in place that are set up to adequately address compliance with any piece rate prohibitions that may be in place, or restrictions, including home working. And what this really means, in essence, is to ask the right questions. You need to be asking your suppliers very directly whether they are, for example, employing people in a home working environment, or whether they are paying piece rate. Often piece rate can be presented in very complex structures, very overly detailed and kind of descriptions. And so you need to get to the bottom of that and really understand, okay, what is happening here? So being able to ask those right questions and to create an environment where that dialogue can take place. So this can be very, very challenging, but it's the only way to identify, and really satisfy yourself as a company that your social audits are really identifying these issues, and so that you can more clearly assess your risk.
Just to add to that, I have to say that for the agriculture sector, the jury is still out on whether piece rate payments themselves are a bad idea or not a bad idea. But while they exist, I know that they are imperfect, but one thing is for sure, that they can't function unless they're supported with adequate social security infrastructure. And Grace already raised this point. There's an example that I recall from a research study that Oxfam had done in the tea sector in India. This was way back in 2013. But one of the things that stayed with me about the study was that one woman daily waged worker was interviewed, and she reported that she lost 2 fingers in a work-related accident. But she wasn't adequately compensated for that. There was no social security, no disability insurances, and so on that kicked in. And she said that because of my accident, my plucking has become very slow. And because of that, I can't make enough money at the end of the day. So you realize that she was not necessarily at fault for her productivity to come down, but because they were not supporting social security infrastructures, she was left at the end of the day with wages perhaps which wouldn't even meet the threshold of a minimum wage. So very important, and this is more of a call to states to ensure that there are adequate social security mechanisms to support their wage infrastructure. The second thing, as Grace had said, for what it's worth, bake living wages into your supplier contracts. We are already working on model clauses with other partner organizations. And at this point, I can also throw it back to CSDDD, which talks about brands using their sphere of influence. So essentially work with your supplier, inform them, incentivize them, influence them through premiums, through long-term contracts, essentially to make sure that your intentions of having a living wage cascade down all the way to the last farm that is producing your coffee or your tea or your cotton. Third thing that I would like to add, that you cannot have these conversations without involving workers. And in fact, I would suggest that instead of reinventing the wheel, there are already organizations doing some great work. BHRC is also doing a lot of work in the space of living wages. Work with the supply chain stakeholders to ensure that workers are paid a living wage, understand the elements in pricing, and make living wages a non-negotiable. So essentially, make sure that when a supplier quotes a price to you, break it down to understand what is the component that's going towards labor. Uh, I must mention one of the recent initiatives by IDH. They recently partnered with some tea companies. I think Lipton's and Twinings are two of them, where they essentially work with tea companies and their plantations that they're sourcing with uh, to work on a living wage methodology that ensures that workers are paid adequate living wages at the end of the day. And lastly, for what it's worth, I would call for companies to come up and publicly commit to living wages. For example, Unilever did it a couple of years ago, where it said that by 2030 we would try and and we will try and ensure at least a living wage or a living income in our supply chain. So yeah, these are the few things that brands can do to make a small dent, so to speak, in the system.
Thank you very much once again for your participation and interesting input on the question raised. To our listeners, thank you for your time, and we hope to have you again next month.